years. We initially thought that this would be a small event, but then it turned out that we had more than 200 people registering. So we're very pleased with that. This is the first symposium in our series on philanthropy and education. We have a very rich program over the coming 2 days, 3 days even, and we'll hope that you'll stick with us for the whole program. To kick this off, I would like to invite Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi to welcome us, to open it up, and I have to excuse Professor Philippe Burin, the director of this institute, who could not be with us, unfortunately. So, welcome again, and let's get going.
Welcome everybody to this inaugural symposium. It's my pleasure to say a few words on the Graduate Institute and then especially on the symposium. As you can tell, the Graduate Institute is in international Geneva, and it is in itself very international. There are over 100 nationalities teaching or studying at the Graduate Institute. And the figure that I was surprised myself, only 12% of the students are Swiss. All the others are from other parts of Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and what have you. So it is a place where we feel very much at home as NORRAG, which is an affiliate program of the Graduate Institute. And the Graduate Institute started a commitment to have education as part of the interdisciplinary program in development studies. So this is my role to help build that specialization within the interdisciplinary program, and we are very pleased that we can contribute to that. Let me say a few words on the symposium. You can see the symposium has a subtitle. It says Global Trends, Regional Differences and Diverse Perspectives. We put actually a lot of thoughts into that subtitle, and let me tell you what we are trying to convey with the subtitle. The global trend might be the one that is clear to all of you, starting with Busan, the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness. There is talk of multi-stakeholder development assistance, of new partners, of private sector joining the international agenda. Partly because there is a shortfall, not partly, mainly I would say because there is a shortfall of funds from ODA, Official Development Assistance. So starting in 2011, there's this talk, and actually in Switzerland we talk about the New Deal in the aid architecture, and it has been picked up strongly in the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So we have become used and accustomed that this is now the global trend. The aid architecture has completely changed as a result of these kinds of new partnerships. The other global trend, and as part of this trend, there's new language like multi-stakeholder collaboration. One institute that I found yesterday on the net, International Development Initiatives in London, uses the term PDAA, like instead of ODA, Official Development Assistance, they use the term Private Development Assistance, which is a very interesting concept. It's not only philanthropy, it's also education bonds, it's just social impact bonds, it is using remittances for social development, it's all kinds of private sector initiatives to support development in developing countries. The second trend maybe it has to do, or the second issue that we are dealing with is it's a new animal, it's a new situation. There's not much research on it. There's more research on philanthropy in North America and impact on education, and or in Europe or in the UK, and Stephen Ball is one of the key researchers in this area. But the research on private sector involvement in developing countries is just starting. And of course, we managed, and we're very happy that we managed to enlist those that really work in that field as scholars such as Tony Verger or Prachi Srivastava and others. But this is a new phenomenon that deserves much more research and much more debate and dialogue. The question is, what are we talking about? How much money is it? And that's a big issue. It ranges from the newest figures I learned this morning from Evelina Oblacevic, who is at the OECD, at the Net Forward department of OECD. If I'm not mistaken, they looked at 100 global philanthropies in this field, not only in education, but in all sectors. And they estimate that per year there is 6.1 billion, or 7.6 billion per year on average, of philanthropic giving into the sector. And in 2013 to 15, it was 22.7 billion. And of course, Gates Foundation is the largest foundation, followed by in health, followed by many others, primarily in the US and in Europe. There are other figures going around, and one of them is exactly this Development Initiatives group in London. And again, they are the ones that coined the term PDA. They say that private development assistance is it's some incredible big number, 44.6 billion, which, if it's true and accurate, which I'm not the person to judge, would be equivalent to 1/4 of all ODA to developing countries. So regardless of how much it exactly is, it is interesting to analyze the trend. It's interesting to analyze the allocation, and it's interesting to also see where the money comes from which private entities. There is also another global trend that is interesting, that more and more countries have a kind of endemic privatization, to pick up on Stephen Ball's term, but almost like part of that endemic privatization, also a legal framework to have more and more social responsibility incentives for companies. I think a great example is actually India. India in 2013 passed the law as part of the companies law that any company that is worth more than $83 million has to give 2% for either health, education, or sanitation. And we're very pleased that education from all these three sectors is the one that gets most of the funding. So this is about the global trends. Let's talk, there are many more, of course, and they will be part of the debate. Let's talk a little bit about regional differences. Because NORRAG is based in Geneva, but it's a global network, it was important for us to, I'm just pressing, right? Maybe it's the wrong finger. This one. Yes. Yes. So it's important to us to also organize events in collaboration with our members in all over the world, in different regions, and to have that regional flavor. For instance, just to give you an example, Latin America is known for a long history of public-private partnership in education, or India is known for linking CSR to the Right to Education Act that they passed. So this is just a tentative list, so it might change. We are looking for partners, both regional university partners in those locations, but also philanthropic foundations. So don't hold us accountable if we are not organizing all of them, but this is the plan that we are actively pursuing. And these are all, so we have started to make contacts, but you see, this is the inaugural conference in November 27, the last conferences with our partner, Qasimi Foundation, in their location in Ras Al Khaimah, with trying to look back and analyze what emanated in the different regional conferences. Lastly, let me finish by saying that we also gave some thought to the third sub-theme, diverse perspectives. we are, what I learned yesterday from Alex Draxler, an honest broker as NORRAG. We try to enable informed dialogue, critical dialogue, bring colleagues that work at opposite ends on important issues in development, bring them together, discuss, publish, share knowledge, share experience. So this is our role as NORRAG. And in this field, there's a lot of differences in opinions, differences of analysis, different conclusions with the same findings, actually, and this is what we are looking forward to discuss in this symposium. So welcome everybody, and I hope we have many fruitful dialogues and also many social interactions as part of this symposium. Let me pass the floor back to our Executive Director, Dr. Joost Monks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take off this slide and come back. Actually, this is a quite ambitious list, and it is tentative, also in terms of thematics. We will talk more about that on the last day when we look forwards based on what we've seen here over the last day today and the coming days that will follow. To set the stage, I have the great privilege of introducing both Natasha Rich, Dr. Natasha Rich, and Dr. Arushi Terway. That will sort of set the stage and probably identify some of the threads that will run throughout the program, building on also on what Gita just said. Dr. Natasha Rich is currently the Executive Director of the Sheikh El Saud bin Sakr Al Qasimi Foundation for Policy Research. Sorry if I said that a little bit wrongly. Prior to this, she was the Acting Director of Research at the Dubai School of Government. She's also a founding member and former president of the Gulf Comparative Education Society. Her latest research focuses on the role and impact of Arab father involvement, philanthropy and education, and access and equity in the Gulf education sector. Natasha holds a PhD from Teachers College, Columbia. And after Natasha, we'll have the great pleasure to hear my colleague, Dr. Arushi Terway, who is our senior lead research associate at NORRAG, but based in India, which very much reflects the decentralized character also of NORRAG. Arushi directs NORRAG's portfolio on private sector engagement in education, which includes innovative financing, philanthropy and education, public-private partnerships, with a special focus, and we hope that this theme will run out throughout the days to come on socially responsible private sector engagement in education. Arushi has worked in education policy planning and development for a number of organizations, including the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, Results for Development Institute, and USAID. She equally holds a PhD from Columbia Teachers College. So without further ado, Natasha, the floor is yours. You both have about 20 minutes. Not sure whether we'll be able to take questions right after this session. If that is not the case, we'll do that after the next panel. Natasha?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you all tonight, this afternoon, both as a co-host of the Symposia in my capacity as Executive Director of the Qasimi Foundation and as a participant being able to speak to you this afternoon. Really, this afternoon I'll be speaking more about giving you an overview of the lay of the land in philanthropy and education, really trying to set the stage for the many much more in-depth and well-researched presentations that are coming later this afternoon and in the next few days. My interest in philanthropy really stems from running a very small philanthropic organisation in the Emirates and observing how the relationships between philanthropic actors and academia and then policymakers was lived out from the inside. And so that sort of prompted me to start thinking about, as an insider, trying to be a bit more critical of my own field, of my own work, but of how that looks and what are some of the challenges that, that going forward with this. As you know, the sector there's been a lot of talk about philanthropy over the years, and philanthropy in education is nothing new. But in recent years, we've seen this mobilization of vast amounts of resources behind it. And I think this has really changed the landscape, and it's changed, as Gita pointed out, the power structures and the governance structures within education globally in particular. And although we've had some very good research done, and most of that I would say is represented in this room, there is still wide open space for a lot more research that could be done in this topic. So it's also to encourage you guys to do some more. So this is just briefly where I'll go today. Just sort of talking about the growth and development, and then philanthropic involvement in the education sector, and then really I'll talk about new actors, partnerships and roles. And then I'll try to conclude by being a bit more, I don't know, maybe provocative, but thinking about promises and pitfalls of increased philanthropic involvement. So we'll see how that goes. So just if we think about philanthropy in general, we know that it has its backgrounds in roots in major religions, and it is nothing new. I mean, in the Middle East where I come from, Islam has a strong history of philanthropic involvement and requirements through zakat. Christianity also has traditions and requirements to give to others and help the poor. But we didn't really see what we know as modern philanthropic organisations are largely viewed with having their roots in the 1920s in the US and 30s, when many wealthy industrialists sought to establish formal foundations for a variety of reasons, cynically maybe related to tax breaks and image improvements, but perhaps other more generous motives as well. So this is where we really started seeing what we saw: Ford, Rockefeller, all these kinds of ones. However, since 2000 is when we saw this explosion. Since 2000, we've witnessed this exponential growth in the number of philanthropic organisations, with 50% of all philanthropic organisations in the US being created since that time. So there's been this dramatic acceleration in the number of philanthropic organisations. And then globally, we still see the US has the lead with that, with over around 87,000 foundations. 85,000 foundations in Western Europe and around 35,000 in Eastern Europe. So we're talking big numbers. But we're also talking an increase in numbers of foundations in the global south. We're talking about numbers increasing in Mexico, in China and Brazil, and even over the Middle East and the Gulf where I'm based. Every year we're seeing more and more foundations being established. In addition to the expansion of the sector, though, the sector is also going a lot of fundamental changes as all these new actors come in. And I'm just going to talk about three briefly. The first is this shift away from grant-giving philanthropy to sort of more venture philanthropy or impact investment or impact philanthropy. And my colleague Arushi is going to talk a little bit more about this kind of shift after me. So this is quite an interesting shift. And something to be noted, though, is that the terminology used around this shift now is quite interesting. So we're talking, if we go to conferences on philanthropy in the Gulf, as I often do, they talk about traditional philanthropy and then innovative philanthropy. And these two are often juxtaposed, set against each other. So you're either a traditionalist or you're innovative. And this has some things for us to think about later when we think about philanthropy. Why do we say that something is traditional if it's grant giving, and why do we say something is innovative if it looks to make a profit? So these are some of the things that I've sort of struggled with as an insider in what do I really, as a foundation leader, what kind of foundation do I want to have? How do I want to be identified? At the moment, I'm very traditional. So I'm thinking about these things. So these are some of the sort of, the language around philanthropic practices is also very interesting to look at. So the second thing that is this trend that we're seeing is this moving from funding programmatic work, which was typically very big, to policy advocacy, or what's been termed muscular philanthropy. So a lot more philanthropic organisations today, they don't just want to be doing, the work in a particular sector, but they want to ensure that the policy framework and the environment around that and the government actors and everybody else is on board with that. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. And finally, this move from being independent and sort of acting alone to seeking global partnerships, such as with the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, and also regional networks. So there's this increasing desire on the part of philanthropic organisations to connect now, to be part of a bigger global scene, but also to leverage up resources as part of that connectivity, making them much more powerful entities than they previously were in the past. So if we move to education, this is just a few little stats on a paper that we did recently on state-funded philanthropy. But education has always been a popular cause for philanthropic activity. It's a feel-good sector. It always looks good to be involved in education. Health is similar. So it remains so. And we look there for the US, we can see in 2014 that philanthropic activity in the USA accounted for in education sector accounted for 75% of all activity. And also it was the highest, the most saturated sector for the UAE as well at 55%. And similarly, combined in the UK, we see around 70% of activity in the UK is to education and youth, so for philanthropic activity. So this is, and in the Gulf, we're seeing this real push towards youth and education, not just for focusing on the Gulf itself, but also focusing on regional stuff. And we see this through big foundations such as Dubai Cares and the Qatar Foundation. So these are quite interesting entities as well. However, as we've been talking about, all of these changes are happening, and it's really, for me, interesting to think about this idea of new actors and new roles and new partnerships. So I think what's been interesting as I've been reading about philanthropy and following the discussion is this idea of big philanthropy. So the first phenomenon, and this is really, we saw it at the beginning with the establishment of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and there's been quite a lot of research and some new research coming with a colleague of mine who's here in the health sector, Ruza, who's doing some more very fascinating stuff on that. But we saw this rise in the number of philanthropic foundations with huge assets at their disposal. And we can see that the world's 27 largest foundation has combined assets of more than $360 billion. I mean, it's big figures. Gita gave a lot of other very big figures as well. But this has really been it's transformative, this amount of wealth behind things. And more recently, our partner institute, Open Societies Foundation, became the second largest philanthropic organization in the US with that transfer of $18 billion to its account. So we're talking vast sums of money behind that. The 10 largest foundations in the world in terms of asset size have a spending power around $170 billion. So that's for global, just the 10 largest. In terms of spending on education, in 2016, OSF spent at least $48 million on education, and the Gates Foundation announced in October this year it would spend more than $1.7 billion over the next 5 years to pay for new initiatives in public education in the US. These are huge sums. Donors of this size are able to exercise considerable sway over policy making and policymakers, especially in an era, as Gita was pointing out, that bilateral and ODA flows are really on the decrease, and nations' commitments to UN bodies are also on decline. Now, some of these have come under scrutiny. The Gates Foundation is now the second largest donor to the World Health Organization, and there's been a lot of talk about the ways in which it shaped the World Health Organization's directions and policy strategies and priorities. So that's something that we need to think about as we move into education and thinking about these actors coming into education. Because the sheer size and resources behind these big philanthropy makes them very attractive partners for governments in the global south, or governments that are just looking to top up in certain areas or have initiatives that they don't want money that is so heavily tight. So in addition to this, we also have seen the emergence of state-funded philanthropy in the Middle East and China to a degree. And this is something that I look at more as a person working for a state-funded organisation. So these have been founded either by individual members of ruling families or their government initiatives, but they command also significant resources, and they've become very powerful actors regionally due to their size and due to their political weight. So they're a very interesting marriage of both politics and wealth, and they've been able to leverage resources across many different entities, and I will show you some of those later. But two of the largest of these are Dubai Cares, as I mentioned before, and Education Above All, or the Qatar Foundation, which have combined funds of around over $2.2 billion just in the region. And while these are still small considered to the US giants, they still do a lot of influence, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they are well connected to government authorities. So it's not just they're not just acting with money alone, they're actually acting with legitimacy and power and some kind of weight behind that. And then the final type of actor, which Arushi will also, I think, go into more detail, is this type of venture philanthropist and philanthropic investments funds. As education has always been seen as a lucrative sector for money making. We've talked about in for-profit education, but it's becoming even more lucrative now in the terms of social impact bonds, venture philanthropy, and people seeking to have returns on philanthropic investments now. So this is another way in which actually leveraging up more money, but money from very, very different sources and sources that we wouldn't ordinarily think about, but through philanthropic entities. So so when we move to new partnerships, and here we have the development of philanthropic networks initially. So, as I said before, philanthropic agencies looking to be more connected to each other. So Gita mentioned the OECD NetFord. That would be a very good example of a recent initiative. and I think we have a representative here, so a networking platform for philanthropies. Also, the Giving Pledge, it's not a network, but it's a commitment where philanthropic organisations come together, set up by Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett, about how they could set new standards of generosity among the ultra-wealthy. And today it's a forum for 170 of the world's wealthiest individuals from 21 countries to ostensibly discuss challenges, successes, failures, and how to be smarter at giving. Now, again, these gatherings, these networks, these agencies, they help learn from each other, and again, they leverage up through combined focus and a combined wealth targeting. So we're also seeing philanthropy partnering more and more with international development organisations, and that's another area of great interest to me as well. UNESCO in particular has been a partner of choice for many philanthropic organisations in the Middle East, and has received considerable funding from the Qatar National Research Fund, Dubai Cares, and others. So we're seeing that it's not just governments that are interested in partnering with philanthropy, it's also big multilaterals. So this leveraging of money by UN agencies as well is really putting big philanthropy in a very powerful position. It's sought after by governments, it's sought after by international development agencies, and it's increasingly sought after by much smaller entities working around the world in the sector, and by smaller philanthropies as well. And finally, we see the state-funded foundation, which I talked about, and I'll just show you their little... So if we look there, we can see that these are some of... So to get a sense of the partners that they work with and what a broad church it is, you can really see there that they're partnering with NGOs and non-profits, corporate and private family foundations, and international agency partnerships as well. So you name it, and they've partnered with it, from ExxonMobil to Columbia Business School to UNESCO, UNICEF, the UN Global Compact. You've got a whole range. So you can see there that they're very active in mobilising these networks and these partnerships. And it's very interesting to me because when you go along to some of these conferences where, as a head of a foundation, it's a very different discussion than the one you go to when you're in academia. So there's a lot more money to it, a lot more catering. But so it's a very interesting format, but interesting. In the past, when we talked about education, we talked about some of the threats and what kind of society we want. And that's what this all comes back to, is what do we believe about education inherently, is why this is important. Because if we believe education is a human right, if we believe that education should be free and equally provided to all with a similar quality for all, then we start to have to look at some of these partnerships and think, well, really, is this going to achieve that globally? So that's something to think of. So then we think about new roles. And this is probably the most, I guess, more than partnerships, this is where it all comes together. So we have new actors, we have new partnerships, but what this has enabled them is to have new roles. So if we see the quote from the OSF 2017 budget, OSF programs or partners are working with partners to make some specific change in the world, to change a particular government policy, to increase the power of a particular constituency, or to change public understanding of an issue. These are quite explicit goals about policy advocacy. So while we've always had foundations lobbying for different things, this is nothing new. The largest foundations now can exert considerable influence on governments that just wasn't possible in the past. One example in the US is the Gates Foundation's support of the Common Core curriculum, which was rolled out across 42 out of 50 states, despite its controversy, and very rapidly, and now it's being rolled back again. And I'll talk a bit more about that idea of pivoting that makes also philanthropic approaches quite interesting. OSF talks a lot about policy influence, as we just said there. And while none of this is problematic in and of itself, it does mean that basically when somebody with all these resources at their hands comes in and decides that a particular policy is what's good for everybody, then they actually have the means by which to achieve that. And the rub comes if that perhaps is not in the best interest of their stakeholders, such as parents, children, teachers, whoever, the rest of us. So this is where the rub comes. And foundations also becoming more active in terms of funding and conducting and disseminating research. And this ties into wanting to be policy entrepreneurs, because one of the things that we know about a lot of this language is the more we use scientization, the more we can measure and rank and count something, the more official it sounds. So the more research we have behind to support a certain initiative, such as low-fee private schools, for example, to say, this is really great, it's really helpful, it's helping out the poor, then the more it lends legitimacy to the argument. So what we see is a lot of this research being funded, and research on both sides of the the fence, really. We can have research that says how wonderful charter schools are, for example, or we can have research, we have a lot of research saying how terrible charter schools are. So this use now of academia as a bit of a, not a boxing ring, but something less violent, but as an arena by which actually foundations can even play out these kind of different ideological stances on education and what they believe about certain practices is something that I think as academics we also need to be more aware of. I mean, at our foundation we fund research, but I fund research that aligns with my beliefs about what education should be. And most philanthropic organizations will do that. But that's essentially guided by one person or a few people at the top. So it's something for me that needs to be thought about very carefully. And finally, big foundations have become much more involved in national education agenda setting. Again, we see, for one example, Sheikha Musa of Qatar is chair of the Qatar Foundation, but also a member of the steering committee of the Global Education First initiative. So she exercises also considerable influence in a global platform for education. So they're becoming, as foundations becoming better connected and larger, and they're able to influence policy much more. So I'll just conclude by talking a bit about potential and pitfalls. So we can see that over the past 20 years, it's very clear there's been an expansion of philanthropic activity. Education, as we said, has always been a popular area for that. In recent years, however, in the US in particular, we've seen various examples of big philanthropy gone bad. That Zuckerberg-Chan's foundation foray into Newark schools and the resultant failure left a lot of unhappiness among stakeholders there. Similarly, as I discussed, the Gates experiment with the Common Core, or its support for charter schools, its then support for small schools, to name a few of the issues that it's been on. Internationally, Zuckerberg and Gates individually also supported low-fee private schools through funding organisations such as Bridge Academies, which again has been highly controversial, both at international and national levels. In some cases, large foundations or mega foundations are also supporting opposing sides of the team. So, for example, in the case of Bridge Academies, we have Gates funding and providing some of the seed capital for that, but then we have OSF funding and Education International, which is providing a critique of that and essentially saying, no, this is not right. So there we see mega donors actually at odds with each other in the same territory. And again, this is for me very interesting, and I'm not sure where that goes. So a lot of proponents will argue that funding from philanthropic foundations comes quickly. So these are some of the potentials. It's more agile, it's less bureaucratic, it's more efficient, it can mobilize, and these are all true. And it offers possibly new solutions to old problems. There's this idea of innovation, this idea that it brings something fresh, especially from the tech sector. But what we see is that this idea, something that's very interesting to me, is this idea of pivoting. And pivoting is very unique to the business world, and it's particular in the tech sector, that basically when one idea doesn't work, you pivot quickly to the next idea and pivot and pivot and pivot and pivot until you find the app or the product or the software that works and that clicks with the market. Now, pivoting works in the business sector. It works very well in the tech sector. In fact, you have to pivot to survive. It doesn't work so well in the education sector. And unfortunately, what a lot of, especially the tech foundations, bring is this idea of pivoting, that if something doesn't work, say the Common Core, oh, it's not working, okay, so we go back. But in the meantime, we're seeing generations of people coming through that are being impacted by this pivoting. So what may work in the sector that these wealthy philanthropists come from does not always translate so well into the education sector. So that's one issue. There's also the issue of accountability, in that big philanthropy only reports to shareholders. They're not elected nor beholden, and they can walk away without really much impunity at all if things do not work out how they did. So really, just to conclude, I think as a member of the philanthropic community, both as an academic and as a head, I think there is the potential to do much good. And I think that philanthropic organisations have the potential to offer a great deal of things to communities. But I think that we need to really think about the communities that we serve and not to become the new masters of aid. Gita pointed out that this was becoming the new scene, and I think it's both good and terrifying at the same time. And I think the other, with big philanthropy, we see, again, big solutions. What scalability, we talk a lot about that, it has to be scalable. If it's not scalable, why would we do it? So we want everything to be scalable. But if we think about education and we think about communities and we think about local people, it really can't be scalable. What works in a village in Peru wouldn't work in, say, Dubai or Abu Dhabi. So this notion that there is a one-size-fits-all solution to education is what strongly comes across in a lot of things. So I think what philanthropic organisations need to do is to think carefully about who are these programs for, what are we really trying to do, and if it is for the greater good, then how can we do that to ensure that we adhere to something that is meaningful for local communities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for giving such an amazing overview of all the issues that hopefully we'll be discussing and debating throughout this symposium. So I invite you all to be constantly thinking about the points that Natasha made and ask those questions during the question and answering session throughout the symposium, through all the panels and parallel sessions. So Natasha gave you a bigger overview of things, and I want to delve a little deeper into this idea or new conceptualization of philanthropy. I'm kind of marrying two different ideas together of innovative financing that's becoming very popular right now and idea of philanthrocapitalism. So what I'm trying to do here is not take a stance on whether this is a good trend or a bad trend, but just presenting the idea that it is happening. This is a global trend. There's a lot of interest within the education sector to use this kind of model a lot more. But as the education community, we need to be a little cautious about it and engage with the audience a lot more in doing the socially responsible giving when it comes to these ideas of venture philanthropy, impact investment, ideas like that. So, as a general outline for my presentation, and I may have to go a little quickly because of the timing in the session, I'm basically going to introduce the idea of innovative financing and the idea of how this can be filling the gap in education financing globally. I'll introduce the idea of philanthrocapitalism and this marriage of innovative financing and philanthrocapitalism, give you some examples of existing models that have potential or have already been piloted in the education sector, and then argue that we need to engage with this industry a lot more, and if we don't, it will just have a life of its own without socially responsible engagement. Okay. So last year, the Education Commission by Gordon Brown came up with these estimates for the financial gap in global education for low and middle income countries. Currently, education sector is about 1.2 trillion per year. That's how much we're spending, and we need to go up to 3 trillion by 2030. How are we going to do that? The proposal is that domestic financing needs to increase substantially. The recommendation is 20% of the national budget needs to be spent on education, and 4 to 6% of the GDP needs to be spent on that. In fact, Education Commission is proposing that for several countries, this would need to go to 8% of national GDP that we would need to spend on education. Along with that, there's a call for international aid to increase for education as well. There has been a decline since 2010. There was a little bit of an uptick, but it's still even though international aid overall is increasing, education sector has been decreasing. So there is a problem there with international aid. We do need to reduce household expenditures. We still don't have a good calculation of what household expenditures are on primary and secondary education, but we need to get that under control if we really want to make the reality of education as a human right and free education possible. We need to reduce those costs. And they're not necessarily school fees. They're all these extra costs that come with sending a child to school. But that will still leave a huge gap in meeting that 3 trillion per year goal. One proposal that the Education Commission has made, and I was part of the team that looked at innovative financing, is that we need to look at the private sector and innovative financing models to fill that gap both at the domestic level, at national level, raise some funds from new sources or use the existing funds in innovative ways. And even at the international level, there's a proposal of a financing facility going on for education that may be becoming a reality in the next couple of years, but there are lots and lots of models that are going around. But what do we really mean by innovative financing? It's a cool term to use for lots of different things, but at the moment, the way we are defining it is twofold. One is using existing funds that are available within the education sector or just in the development sector in innovative manner that will maximize or improve the results somehow. So there needs to be some kind of incentivization going on there to improve the outcomes that per dollar reaches. The other way of thinking about it is raising additional funds from new sources. Now, I'm not going to say we've exhausted the existing resources, but there's the gap that exists needs to find some other resources. However, these new resources will require us to rethink how we design the financing models. It's not going to be the traditional charitable giving or going through basic aid. We'll need to design something different to attract these new sources of funding. Overall, in development, the trend has been going on, or this conversation has been going on since early 2000s. And one of the estimates that came out was that between 2000 and 2013, innovative financing within the development sector provided about $121 billion, which is a huge sum. This doesn't mean this was coming from private sector. This means they were just interesting mechanisms being used to raise extra funds. This has been used a lot more in the health sector and in the climate change and environmental sector. Education has not seen enough innovative financing mechanisms in there. Some estimates are between 2002 and 2010, 5.5 billion within health, 31 billion in climate change. Within education, the World Bank, in their innovative financing mechanisms, showed that only 1.6% of the innovative financing was going to education, and health was actually receiving 12.2%. So it's a huge gap between the two sectors. Just to give you some examples, I know I keep using the word innovative financing, but just to give you some tangible examples of terms you may have heard within this. I have a paper at the bottom that gives a much larger overview of about 20 models, but these are some that you may have heard in other contexts, something called loan buy down. This is not exactly private sector funding always, but basically if a country has taken a loan from a multilateral bank, another entity, whether it's another bilateral institution or a private sector institution, can buy down the principal or the interest of that loan. So basically just reducing the cost of the loan to the country. So this is a very popular concept. And in the last GPE replenishment, Islamic Development Bank pledged $400 million for loan buy downs for GPE countries. Another very popular one that the health sector used was this IFIM model, which was a financing facility for immunization, and they raised $5 billion in vaccine bonds since 2006. Another very popular innovative financing model, which is actually not a very complicated model, it's just rebranding of old ways of doing things, is green bonds. This is something that multilateral banks have issued on Wall Street, private companies have issued. Basically, whenever they need a bond type loan from the private capital market, and they're somehow using that for climate change or environmental purposes, they label it as green bond. And lots of companies that are trying to do socially conscious investment, and this is for-profit investment, it's not saying that they're not going to get a financial return, they are more attracted to it. A lot of investment portfolios have some commitment towards a percentage of that portfolio to be spent on socially responsible investment. So they're the ones buying these types of bonds. And this could be money coming from you and me. We have money in our bonds, our mutual funds, and that's what's being invested by investment firms into these green bonds. So you can look at the paper for a lot more examples, especially examples that have potential for the education sector. But I'm going to get into more of a sub-theme within this innovative financing and problematize the conceptualization of traditional philanthropy. And by traditional philanthropy, I mean, traditional philanthropy, I really mean charitable giving, the grant giving model. So this is the concept of philanthropic capitalism. This is not a new concept. Carnegie, Rockefeller, all of them have been using it for all these years, but basic idea is to use business concepts in philanthropy. But there's a side model of this, which is using philanthropic concepts in business models. So whenever you're making any business decisions, actually thinking about the social return on that as well. So it's a two-way street. It's not just about philanthropic giving and using business practices in that, but on the other hand, thinking about the social impact of the general business as well. So the marrying of innovative financing here is that a lot of philanthrocapitalism type of models are saying that they can harness innovative financial models to encourage certain groups of people to be investing in social impact type of investments. So it's a departure from the traditional grant-giving, grantee relationship. And another thing that they claim is that with this idea of going for results and using a business approach, they're a lot more hands-on with the investments they're making. It's not just about transferring the finances or doing the financial investment, but they're actually supporting whichever program, industry that they're putting money in. And it has a combination of social and financial return. The proportion may change depending on the model. Some of them have no financial return, but use business concepts. Others have a large financial return, but some idea of a social impact as well. So this is kind of blurring the lines, or is blurring the distinction between markets and morals. They're saying they're not using the traditional concepts we use for philanthropy of just charitable giving. They're just saying, let's get to the solution. If there's a financial model we can use to get to the solution, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, we don't care about that. We're just trying to get to the solution. This is what they're saying. I'm not saying that's what actually happens, but that's the concept that's been thrown around there. They also claim that because of this, they are more results-driven than traditional philanthropies or charitable giving or even the government, because their whole focus is the outcome itself. And financial innovation itself allows them to take higher risk than the government or other types of models, because they're able to take higher risk in programs that may fail. That's what the claim is. I'm going to give you very quick overview of a few of the models, and I'm kind of going through a spectrum of models that are more about social return and models that are slightly more about financial return. Corporate social responsibility is a little complicated. It is more about giving. However, there's a sense of the company also benefiting from it, whether it's from marketing or name recognition, things like that. But an interesting partnership model here is India, which Gita mentioned earlier, where India has a mandated law now that companies above 83 million have to spend 2% of their profits in corporate social responsibility. And education happens to be the most popular sector to spend. And in 2016, 2017, 35% of these CSR funds went into education and skills development. Now in India, corporate social responsibility is not always private corporations doing it themselves, but they set up these separate foundations and societies to do it. So it is still, to a large extent, traditional philanthropy. And there's no direct financial return for this. Venture philanthropy. This gets a little bit more complicated, where there's still not necessarily a financial return, but the concept is that they're using venture capital finance type of models, but with philanthropy. They're investing in high-risk social entrepreneurs who may be providing solutions for a very specific problem. And then venture capitalists or venture philanthropists support them with financial and non-financial resources to get them to their results. Most often, even though the venture philanthropist will not be making a profit, the programs they're supporting would more or less be profit-seeking programs. So 2 examples of this, one of the most controversial and popular ones is Omidyar Network, which is founded by the founders of eBay, and they call themselves a philanthropic investment firm. They themselves have a for-profit arm and a non-profit arm because they say they don't really care about those lines. They're just going to invest in institutions and find the right financial model to get to the social impact. So sometimes they're investing in for-profit institutions with their for-profit arm, and sometimes they're investing in non-profit with their for-profit or non-profit arm. It just, those distinctions get decided based on the program itself. Acumen Fund, which is very well-established and old fund, they themselves are a non-profit organization. However, they invest through loans and equity, not grants, into for-profit entrepreneurs. So these are ways where we're blurring the lines on whether you're making a profit or not. The goal is social impact. Social impact bonds, we'll hear a lot more about this by Maya. She's a keynote speaker from UBS Optimus later in the program, but just to give you a quick overview, this is a partnership between investment firms, foundations, and implementer and evaluators. So basically what happens in a development impact bond is some kind of a private investor puts in the upfront money into a program or an institution to get to the pre-agreed results. And then later on, a donor will pay back the investors the money that they gave plus an interest or some kind of a profit margin if the program is successful. So all the risk is transferred over to the investment firm, which is making a profit out of it, but they are also taking a huge risk. If the program fails, they do not get anything. Within education, Educate Girls in Rajasthan is experiment in development impact bonds that's being tried. It's in its first year, and they claim that they've actually gotten 40% of their investment back already because they were meeting the outcome goals that they had actually put forward. Impact investment. This is more complicated because it's more about financial return, less about social return, but it's encouraging investors like you and me to put our money where there is a social return as well. We're still making a profit, our money is still making money, but it's going to social causes. There's possibility of a lot of funding in it, but with a lot of caution along with it, because private sector is very much interested in education as a profit-making business. Global Impact Investor Network actually says that education in emerging markets is one field where impact investors are very interested. And one very recent study by Kairos firm called Business in Africa report actually evaluates the investment opportunity within education, and they came out with the figures that there's $13 to $15 billion $13 to $15 billion worth of business to be done in for-profit schools at K-12 level, and about 8 billion of this is meant for low-fee private schools, which is a caution for our community that this much money can be flowing in beyond the investment that's already been made there. So I won't go into these examples that much, but you might be familiar with some of them. I only have 2 minutes to wrap up, so I'll do that quickly. So I'm going to argue that whether we agree with this approach or not, there's a need for engagement and partnership here. And I don't mean engagement as in support, but engagement with debate, engagement with further rigorous research. If companies are claiming that they're reaching these outcomes, who's measuring it? Who are they accountable to? We need to be asking those questions. So I'm going to say that we need to be bringing in businesses, philanthropies, nonprofits, government, civil society, social entrepreneurs, researchers, and aid agencies together to discuss this topic a lot more, put more money in research, provide more guidelines, really look at the equity factors, whether all these investments are actually ensuring equity and education as a human right. Governments need to regulate this market a lot more. World Bank Saber is looking at PPPs and is discussing government regulations of PPPs rather than saying PPPs should not happen in education. And I would also encourage us to be a little bit more open and transparent about both failures and successes of these models. We do need to look at the data. We do need to push for research. We need to look at the impact here and be open to innovation in this and be open to both failures and successes. I'll end right there and move into the next session because we're already over time. Okay, thanks.
Right. So thank you very much, Arushi and Natasha. I think you have raised a number of very essential issues, blurring lines and new masters of eight. Hopefully we'll come back to these issues when we wrap up on Friday, and this will lead us through our discussions amongst many other topics that we will bring up. So I have the pleasure of now inviting the panelists for the first panel, which precisely talks about trends and approaches, motivations for philanthropic engagement in education. So please, if all the participants, Olaf, Tony, please come up here. Gita, you will moderate this. If there's further presentations, please come and we can upload them. Thank you.
So I hope you're not getting tired of me. We are having a new round of interesting presentations and discussions. Two of the colleagues that are scheduled to be here, they're doing actually fieldwork as we speak, and they will join us by Skype, Professor Prachi Srivastava and Robin Reed. So we will zoom them in later. Let me introduce you to the colleagues that are here with me physically. Let me start with Professor Tony Verger. Tony is in our field of international comparative education and sociology of education, I would say the leader on public-private partnerships in education, working in different settings, not only in Europe, but also Latin America, globally. His dissertation, I believe, was on GATS and WTO at the University of Amsterdam. And he's right now the director of one research institute that deals with globalization, GEPS, and globalization and education, and also an Erasmus Plus program that offers a master's degree in this field. I've been in Barcelona. It's a vibrant intellectual community with amazing doctoral students and postdocs that Tony built single-handedly and in collaboration with very good colleagues there. Marina Avelar, she completed her master's and bachelor's in Campinas in Brazil, and she's currently a doctoral student of Stephen Ball in London. She is well published already and has a really interesting paper just come out this year in the International Journal of Educational Development. It's called Mapping New Philanthropy on the hierarchical state, the mobilization of the national learning standards in Brazil. Then we have Clara Fontevilla. She's a doctoral student of Tony Verger, and she has, you co-authored 11 different pieces, 2 or 3 of them in peer-reviewed journals, including one book co-authored last year with Tony Verger and with Sancajo. I don't know if Sancajo, and the title of that book is The Privatization of Education, a Political Economy of Global Education Reform. And Clara, that book was with TC Press in New York. But she also co-published in the British Journal of Sociology of Education, and one article is currently under review with the Journal of Education Policy, but maybe I should not have said that because of the blind review. Is that too late already? But it's published? Okay, wonderful. Then we have Tamo Chattopadhyay. He is associate professor. He did his doctorate in comparative education and economics at Columbia University. And he is currently associate professor and founding director of the Institute of Education at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And before that, he was faculty member at the university that the Americans call Notre Dame, that we call Notre Dame in Geneva. And we are very happy to have you here. Closer? Okay. Then we have Olaf Hahn. He has educational background in Germany, in the US, and in France. He's historian by background, but also studied literature and Catholic theology in Lyon and Paris, and has worked as an academic for a while in Poland, in Gdansk, and also in the executive education program at INSAT. He has joined the Robert Bosch Foundation in 2011, and for the first 4 years he was the head of the Department Education unit, and it's called Department of Education, Society and Culture. And since 2016, always at the Bosch Foundation, he serves as the Senior Vice President for Strategy with a focus on education in Africa. In addition, since May 2016, he is the founding director of ESSA, which stands for Education Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a UK domiciled charity active in the support of higher education. We are very pleased to have Olaf asking critical questions at the very end. Also by Skype, I'm very pleased to welcome, are we sure that the Skype works? Oh, yes, it works. Wow, that's wonderful. Is that Prachi's laughter?
It is my laughter.
Oh, wow, so good to see you. So wonderful. So these are professors, Prachi Srivastava and Robin Reed, both at Western University. Prachi is associate professor, tenured associate professor in University of Western Ontario. And Robin, I think you're a postdoctoral fellow and very lucky to work with Prachi, who is a big capacity in our fields and expert on low-fee private schooling. And she mobilized the debate on low-fee private schooling in our field. Robin herself has also published, I hope I'm keeping it a little bit short. I have a whole list, but let me keep it short. Robin, the one piece that is mentioned a lot is the bibliometrical analysis of World Bank publications on public-private partnerships. I think that's where you established yourself as a scholar in our field. So, Prachi has a very interesting blog and is very active on social media on low-fee private schooling and PPP in developing countries. So having said this was a long, maybe too short still, announcement, let's move with the first presentation. And it's a presentation by 3 colleagues, Tony, Marina, and Clara. I think it's better if you stand up so everyone can see you. And we are having live streaming, I think, in this session also. So colleagues can participate from a distance.
Okay. So, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Gita, for the introductions, and to NORRAG and partners for organizing such an interesting event. It's a big pleasure to be here. Our presentation is about the different strategies of policy influence of the private sector with a focus on philanthropic organizations, and I think that our paper fits very well with what was said previously about the changing role of these traditional foundations, grant giving foundations, toward a more venture entrepreneurial role when it comes to promote policy change, systemic reform, also in education. So our presentation will be structured in 3 main parts. So I will introduce our paper, justify why we did this research and how we did it. And then both Marina Avelar and Clara Fondevila will present the main results, so the different strategies of policy influence that we have identified in the literature, and we will conclude. So, when it comes to literature on education, privatization, educational reform, we have witnessed how there is an emerging role of new actors that are not the traditional, let's say, state actors or even traditional NGOs and teacher unions. So, in a recent literature review that actually Gita was talking about, that we did with Clara and with Adrian, that we were trying to identify the different trajectories toward education privatization, we saw how in some particular cases there were these emerging actors, mostly corporate actors, but also private foundations, philanthropic organizations that were very active when it comes to advocate for particular forms of educational reform. And in the literature in general, in the literature on political sociology, political science, the role of the corporate sector when it comes to influence policy is usually addressed through the concept of lobbying. And we think that, of course, lobbying is a very important mechanism of influence of the private sector. But what we were seeing in all this emerging literature is that there are also other ways, maybe less formalized ways of policy influence that are being articulated by the private sector and by philanthropic organizations in particular. So this is why we decided to do this paper trying to systematize and build a category of emerging forms of policy influence deployed by philanthropic and corporate organizations. So to develop this paper, we did a systematic review of the literature. We basically reviewed more than 200 pieces of research, mostly published in academic publications, but also in different reports and what is called grey literature. So in an inductive way, we could identify and build these 4 categories of or strategies of policy influence that we call knowledge mobilization, networking and brokerage, supporting grassroots advocacy, and the 4th one is a sponsorship of pilot experiences that, as I said, my colleagues will tell you more about it. These strategies were especially emerging in particular contexts, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, also because there is more literature about education policy, education reform in the UK, in the US, and these countries are also well known by the role of private foundations, consultancy firms in shaping policy reform, but also in developing countries, like especially low-income countries, post-conflict states, we also witnessed how these private actors were having a bigger and bigger role in shaping educational policy reform, sometimes as a way to address some capacity issues with the states of these countries. So just 2 very short definitions to make sure that we are in the same page when it comes to understand what type of actors are we talking about. In our paper, we are not only talking about philanthropic organizations, we are talking about corporate actors that include philanthropic organizations, but not only. Also, EDI businesses like Pearson are very active also in the promotion of educational reform, advocacy networks, policy entrepreneurs that sometimes are very complex networks that include philanthropic organizations, corporate foundations, but also other types of actors, the media, NGOs, etc. And then in the way that we defined as strategies is like a range of repertoires to which corporate actors purposely and strategically resort to exert some form of policy influence in the education reform domain. So, say this, I would like to invite my colleagues to talk to you about these 4 particular strategies.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you, Tony. Thanks everyone for coming and for the invitation to be here. So going to the first strategy, it's knowledge mobilization, which echoes a lot what was discussed earlier. So this strategy takes place in a context in which policy is understood to be or supposed to be based on evidence. And this evidence is no longer produced only by traditional actors such as universities or research institutes, but we see this emergence of what we call intermediary organizations, which collect, package, and promote knowledge. Those organizations, they are very often funded, supported, sometimes even owned by big philanthropy, large foundations. And this puts those philanthropies organizations in a very privileged position in the policymaking arena, because it gives them a space to participate and even frame the policy debate in education. And this also gives them a good platform to reach a very wide audience, because this is the kind of material that will speak to policymakers and decision makers, but also the wide public and the general opinion on education matters. So what we see is a kind of departure from traditional philanthropy, but also maybe traditional evidence. Because this kind of evidence is increasingly used in a way that blurs boundaries between research and advocacy. So we see that sometimes foundations will use evidence in a cherry-picking way. As an example, we see the advocacy for low-fee private schools, that although the literature is quite divided in the topic, it's only a part of it that is used in the advocacy and in policy-making spaces. And we see the echo chamber effect, which is the idea that a small community can keep referring to each other in how they do their studies and their advocacy, and this creates a feeling of consensus when people that do criticism might be excluded from this debate. And this has been seen in the US in pro-market reforms over there, with support of big philanthropy like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Dell. And in this scenario, the press is also very relevant. And although using the media is not new at all in policymaking, but perhaps what is new is that foundations are deliberately trying to occupy this space to advocate for their ideas. And philanthropists quite often are referred to and invited to comment on topics as specialists on education reform. Then the second strategy that again echoes a lot what was spoken about earlier is networking and brokerage. So this revolves around the idea of using connections to spread policy ideas and advocate for reforms. We can split this mainly into formal and informal aspects. In the formal aspects, we see true coalitions. So this is done through formal partnerships. Sometimes it involves contracts. It's a kind of more stable relationship. And a good example is Todos pela Educação from Brazil. This is a corporate coalition. It brings together business companies, foundations, policy entrepreneurs, some bureaucrats from government, and they have been very relevant in pushing forwards pro-market reforms in the country. Not only that, they have actually created Reduca, which is a regional network, and indeed we can look at it as a network of networks, because it brings together kind of Todos pela Educação from other countries of the region, and they have their events to discuss how to better advocate for market reforms in their own countries in Latin America. But then networks also depend a lot on more informal practices, which we refer to as being meetingness. So it's kind of what we're doing here. It's doing seminars, doing conferences, but but also doing more informal things like going for lunch and having meetings over breakfast. And this is very important in creating strong bonds and trust. And a good example has been in the advancement of low-fee private schools in the Global South, with conferences that bring together international players with local ones. So just to wrap up networks, we see policy entrepreneurs as being very important, playing a role in creating connections, and quite often creating connections between public and private spheres. It's what we call boundary spanning. And this also creates the effect of revolving doors, which shows us the permeability, a growing permeability between public and private. And this permeability happens both ways. So people that used to work in the government move into philanthropy, and also the other way around, people from philanthropy being hired by governments. So Clara will continue.
Thank you. So yeah, moving to the third strategy, what we find is maybe a more indirect strategy in which philanthropies or corporate actors try to sponsor or incentivize or support the activity of grassroots organizations. In some cases, this translates in the direct funding of these civil society organizations, and in other cases, through the provision of funding to maybe advocacy campaigns, citizen-led advocacy campaigns. And this maybe is a more indirect strategy, as I was saying, but it's a powerful approach in that it creates a pressure to the legislative or executive branches of the government to do something to push for reform. Also, this type of a strategy has the potential of making some radical or controversial reforms more palatable or politically rewardable if they are deployed or portrayed as a popular demand. So maybe to be sure, this strategy is very much confined to the United States, but we find quite illustrative examples there, like this philanthropic funding for these new civil rights movements, like the Black Alliance for Educational Options, and also HCREO, which is the same but for Hispanic groups. These groups are grassroots organizations, but have benefited greatly from the funding of the 6 big philanthropies in the States. Also, it's also quite illuminating or illustrative the case of the Yes On 1240 campaign in the state of Washington, which received the key financial support of the Gates Foundation and other foundations. However, it has to be remarked that this is very much an unarticulated corpus of literature, which is on the making, basically. So it's not always referred as this idea instrumenting grassroots advocacy, but sometimes referred with other terms like indirect strategies, outside lobbying, constituency influence, and so on. And finally, our fourth and last strategy is the direct provision and sponsorship of pilot experiences, or what in our paper we call leading by example. This strategy maybe has 2 main translations or materializes in 2 different modalities. The first one is the development and support of demonstration projects, pilot projects, which are presented as punctual interventions, but are advanced with a view of being scaled up and implemented at a more macro level. And also the philanthropic or corporate sector has been keen on directly supporting private providers of education or providers of auxiliary services in education. But however, the underlying theory of change here is that if you can demonstrate that the project works, that this is a best practice, ultimately policymakers or people in charge will have to react to that and maybe scale the project up and adopt it at a more systematic level. This is frequently legitimized in terms of creating a space of innovation, flexibility, etc. But it is maybe important to remark that there are some important risks associated to that, like what some authors have denominated the emergence of some jurisdictional challengers, which are these organizations that end up replicating and replacing and even competing with the government in the provision of the education service, what can ultimately disincentivize state-led action. And here we have 3 different examples. I think it's important to remark that this strategy can be observed in the global north, clearly the case of the US, but also we have illustrative examples in the global south. This would be the case of Brazil, in which a government-led plan has created the opportunity for private providers to list some interventions that are subsequently validated by a state or state or local authorities as valid policies to be adopted at a state level. And finally, maybe it's also a good example would be the Partnership Schools for Liberia case. A couple of years ago, the Liberian government announced its willingness to outsource an important part of the education system to private providers or private managers. And while initially the idea was to have a single provider, which was Bridge International Academies, finally, and after some international pressures or criticism, it was decided that many other providers would be inserted in the scheme. However, what's important here maybe is the persuasive potential that the Bridge experience portrayed as a proven success has had in inspiring this kind of large-scale reform. And as moving to our conclusion section, this is very much a preliminary study, and as we said, we don't pretend to adopt an exhaustive approach here, but however, some preliminary conclusions can be drawn at this point. First of all, what we see is that, and this was in fact our starting premise, the private sector contribution cannot be equated, anymore at least, to supply-side or giving and loving activity. In fact, what we see is that there is the private and corporate sector engages in an increasingly diverse range of roles. And what's important here is that private sector influence or philanthropy influence cannot be equated to, is not anymore a function of their economic power, but also has to do with other capitals like the symbolic capital. We can witness an effort to adopt some markers of a scholar or academic or scientific proficiency in order to present itself as a legitimate actor, and there is also an increased effort in mobilizing some sort of social capital. These maybe is not a new trend, but what is unprecedented is this deliberate effort to create and sustain these networks. A second conclusion that can be pointed out here is that this association between the formal status of a private actor and thus preferred strategy does not seem to be so operative right now. So this idea that outsider actors like philanthropists who are not officially included as stakeholders in education debates, this idea that these actors have necessarily to rely on second-best approaches in order to influence policy seems not exactly adequate, since the most productive approaches is the combination of different sort of strategies. And finally, the consequence of that is that we observe some blurring lines between different types of actors, the corporate, the philanthropy, and the public sector, and some organic relations which entail some risk of maybe competing interest or conflicts of interest. So we have this opens some research gaps which may encourage new research like the structural determinants which enable the emergence of these strategies, the institutional features within organizations that are more fertile to this kind of approaches, and the political motivation, economic, etc., behind this the engagement in this kind of activity. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clara, Marina, and Tony. Let's move on to the Skype presentation by Professors Prachi Srivastava and Robin Reed.
So this is a pre-recorded presentation. Prachi and Robin will be available for Skype, with Skype for question and answer afterwards. Hopefully everything will work.
Hi from Singapore. I'm Dr. Prati Srivastava, Associate Professor at the University of Western Ontario. This is my colleague, Dr. Robin Reed. She is working as a postdoctoral associate at the University of Western Ontario. We are in Singapore. We are currently collecting data for this project that we're going to talk to you about. And so we're sorry that we can't be there in person. But we will join you for the live discussion, and if you have any comments or questions about our paper or our study, feel free to ask us during the live discussion, and also you can email us at any time. We're happy to connect with you later on. So this paper is a background paper, a concept paper for a larger study that we're working on. The largest study is jointly supported by the Brookings Institution as well as the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and it is on philanthropic and impact investors in education. We are focusing on Southeast Asia and the Pacific and South Asia as two regions to look at for this larger study. And as a result, we thought it was very important for us to actually think about how we would conceptualize these actors, both private philanthropic investors as well as impact investors. So the larger study is actually trying to map financing flows, target geographies, and sector priorities for regional and domestic actors in these regions. But as we started getting closer into the actual data collection or getting to try and extract data from organizations, we realized one very important thing, which is that the conceptualizations around these different kinds of actors are very fuzzy. And as a result, to actually collect data on them, we needed to actually firm those conceptualizations. So this paper takes one step back from the larger study, and it's going to address two issues. The first issue is one around conceptualizing different types of private sector actors and how we then narrowed into the two types that we are interested in. And the second part of it is actually testing the methodology of using network analysis on these sector actors in this region, because it hadn't yet been done. Using network analysis methodology was a very consistent and deliberate, well, it's a very deliberate choice on our part, particularly because a result of the lack of transparency is actually, one of the reasons for the lack of transparency is actually the strong ties and social networks that organizations within this sector seem to have. And you almost have to be in the know to understand exactly what it is they are doing and who they're doing it through. So for example, you might have funders who are implementing programs through an implementing organization, and it follows a chain which isn't necessarily transparent or clear to the public or to others outside of the sector. So we looked to network analysis because it actually relies on the role of networks and social ties. And there has been several scholars that have started to employ this technique in education, particularly looking at non-state actors. Famously, a lot of the work by Stephen Ball and his colleagues, but a lot of that work has been done in what we would call Western or Northern contexts. There's been relatively little application of this technique to developing country contexts and other regions. So we are trying to use this to see if it's an applicable methodology, and in particular to use it with the types of organizations that we're interested in. One of the strengths of using network analysis is that it allows you to use attributes or to assign attributes or characteristics to your units of analysis. In this case, the organizations or the private foundations and the impact investors, or the organizations of non-state private actors for this particular paper. Now, where it was problematic because there are very few typologies that actually look at type of non-state private actors. For the countries and locations of operation, as well as for the education subsectors, we used the World Bank typologies, which we thought were pretty strong and robust, particularly for education subsector because it also gives nature of activities in education. But when we got to type of non-state private actor, it was a huge question mark for us in terms of how do we operationalize this. As the literature has noted, the typologies are fuzzy, there's lack of consistency. And so for this particular paper, we decided to focus on 3 broad categories: for-profit, hybrid, and not-for-profit. The not-for-profit and the hybrid organizations were later operationalized as private foundations for the larger project, and that includes independent, family, and corporate private foundations, which is coming out of a typology from Martin and Witt. And then we actually focused on impact investors for the hybrid organizations, and we used characterization or definition of impact investors by Jin. For the for-profit organizations, it was left open in the context of this paper, and we don't address for-profit providers or for-profit actors in the larger study, just because for the purposes of the larger study, we want to focus more on the mixed and the not-for-profit sector.
Hi, so for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to focus in on the background study that is the main focus of the paper we're presenting today. And for the purpose of this study, we utilized the Center for Education Innovations Program database, which is maintained by Results for Development. And this is a free, publicly accessible resource which houses organizational profiles for, at the time of this research, over 700 non-state private organizations which are currently implementing programs in the education sector around the world. For the purpose of our study, we included all of the different topic areas with the exception of early childhood education. And additionally, we only included those programs that were being implemented in the primary and lower secondary sectors. And this is because for the purpose of this study, we just wanted to focus in on the basic education sector. This resulted in a list of 487 programs, which we then further refined by only including those programs which had been externally evaluated. And the result was a list of 142 programs being implemented by 134 different organizations. We utilized several indicators that were listed on the CEI database. In particular, as Prachi noted, we looked at the profit status or the profit motive of the implementing organization. And those included not-for-profit, for-profit, and hybrid actors as defined by CEI in the organizational profile. We also looked at the launch country and the additional countries that the programs were being implemented in, as well as the funders that were supporting these implementers. So for the purpose of this study, we took these 142 organizations and the 134 different implementers, and we used Excel in order to run the descriptive statistics. We found that the 142 programs included in our dataset were being implemented in 99 countries around the world. However, the majority were actually occurring in a much smaller subset of countries, with only 18 countries having 5 or more programs being implemented within the country. But actually 4 countries accounted for over 1/3 of all of the programs that we included in our data set, and these include India, South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda. These findings support the anecdotal and emerging evidence in the literature that non-state private engagement in the Global South tends to be concentrated in a small number of countries. And one could extrapolate based on these findings that the concentration is occurring in the larger emerging economies like India and South Africa, as well as in those countries that have long, well-documented histories of non-state private engagement in education, such as Kenya and Uganda. As Prachi noted earlier, the lack of consensus around terminology and definitions poses key challenges to completing research on non-state private engagement in education. So, for the purpose of this analysis, we took a pragmatic approach, and we utilized some of the 57 predefined indicators listed in the CEI database in order to take a closer look at what types of educational programs are being implemented. Here we examine the key programming areas being addressed by using CEI's typology for key areas of innovation, which they use to help organize their database. We found that almost 2/3 of all the programs included in our dataset focused on school support and student support as the main programming area. Teacher training was the most significant, and it accounted for almost 72% of all of the school support programs and 23% of all the programs included in our dataset. Also of note, given the concerns raised in the literature about the increased involvement of non-state private actors and the confluence of private school chains and networks in certain countries, we found that chains or networks of schools and education centers accounted for 61.5% of all education delivery services, and that's 18% of all of the programs included in the dataset. We also took a look at each program's profit motive, using the profit motive as listed on each program's organizational profile in the CEI database. In total, we found that 92% of the programs included in our dataset were listed as not-for-profit. This is an interesting finding, as concerns raised in the literature generally focus on commercially motivated actors. However, we recognize that this finding requires further investigation. Specifically, we wonder if there are organizations that are listed as not-for-profit that are actually operating programs or initiatives that in fact do generate profit, or if there are institutional loopholes which are allowing actors to be officially designated as not-for-profit while functioning with profit modalities. For example, in some countries, profit-oriented programs, particularly in basic education, are actually illegal. The most commonly cited example of this is India, which ironically is also noted in the literature as a country with a high concentration of private sector engagement, including for-profit provision. However, while these are important considerations, we're not able to address them based on this data alone, so further research is required. We conducted a preliminary network analysis to examine the relationships between the program implementers and their funders. This analysis excludes 44 programs which did not list any funder data on their CEI profile. So the network you see here represents 98 programs, and it includes 89 implementers and 356 funders. In the CEI network, funders are depicted as square nodes, while program implementers are circular nodes, and they've been color-coded according to their profit motive. Additionally, all of the nodes are sized based on their degree centrality, meaning implementers with more funders are depicted as larger nodes, as are funders that support more than one program. In total, this network contains 30 components, or distinct groups of interconnected nodes. 29 of these components can be found in the outer ring, and they account for 35% of all the implementers and 24% of all the funders included in the network. Since the CEI database is focused on collecting data on what it terms innovative educational programs, rather than collecting all of the data on all of the programs being implemented or funded by any one actor, it wasn't surprising to find a number of instances of disconnected components in the network. However, given this fact, we were quite surprised to find the majority of program implementers and funders included in our analysis were actually interconnected. While not-for-profit implementers typically had more funders, apart from one organization, all the for-profit implementers included in this network were connected to at least one funder. However, those funders simultaneously provided funding to at least one not-for-profit program implementer as well. And this illustrates the challenge of determining the profit motive of organizations and supports claims in the literature that private sector investors in basic education can occupy a blurry position on profit. The network analysis here demonstrates that there are far more private actors engaged in education in the South than one might assume, and this is just based solely on the number of actual private actors implementing programs in basic education. And while the analysis needs further refinement, initial results seem to suggest that there is some empirical credence to the anecdotal evidence that suggests non-state private actors engaging in education operate in interconnected ways and through complex relationships. So that's our presentation. Thanks very much for accommodating us today, and we're really looking forward for the discussion that's coming up in a few minutes. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Very easy job for me as a moderator. It was a wonderful presentation. Tamo, can I pass the floor to you?
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here, and yes, I did my doctorate at Teachers College, Columbia, and Gita was one of my first professors in the comparative ed class. And it's also an honor to be on a panel with people whose work I have used extensively, Tony's and Prachi's I've referenced. I must say that this is a topic I got really interested in during the 2 years when I was in India. I left my job at Notre Dame and went back to India, and I was an unsuccessful philanthropist. I have naively taken some savings and thought I would do some great education NGO work, and all my savings ended, and no results, significant results were achieved. However, I was able to employ those savings in a way that I wanted. And so it became very personal. I actually was able to go into a public girls' school in the city of Calcutta and offer something that the state education agency was not against it, but was not willing to support. Basically, cultural programs. I started showing these girls films. Because the state was not very keen on doing anything that they saw was not really educational. So I said, well, films could be very educational, especially these are good films. So to make a long story short, this is the time, these 2 years, when I also got a first-hand understanding of the way private capital makes its way to public goods, particularly in a country like India, where I am from originally. So I had a somewhat of an insight, perhaps. And I know, Arushi, you were based there. You're probably doing much more, closely. You're following the scene. What started off as an interest in the low-fee private schools has now gotten into trying to understand the role of private capital. And here I probably not very accurately will be using this category, private philanthropist, although I know, Prachi's paper and the work is much more rigorously looking at these categories. The other thing before I get into giving a few, insights from the paper is that I don't have a PowerPoint, so this is the deal, which may be not bad, just that I'm. We had a few PowerPoints. So the question, is I would like to ask, and I kept asking myself, thinking about theorizing private philanthropies. Where does money come from? I mean, for something to be given, something has to be first be there. So, and that's the kind of where I kind of start my paper, and I'll just, for the sake of time. I'll just read this brief paragraph. Wealth accumulation in capitalist economies is inherently a competitive profit maximization exercise, often at great cost to public welfare. This is increasingly so in a globalized economy where distant lives are interconnected through asymmetric distribution of production and consumption. Consequently, sources of funds should constitute a core dimension of an analytical framework of philanthropic endeavors. And then basically I go into the two other mechanisms and purposes. Why are these funds being deployed, and what are the mechanisms? I must admit that the prior presentations they have practically highlighted most of the things that I wanted to say, and it's probably not uncommon, because these are the things that we are all who are interested in this are beginning to observe. I will just try to say, how I see this as a framework: sources, purpose, and mechanisms as a potential way of thinking about private philanthropic engagement in public education. So, sources of funds, I would make a distinction between kind of a savings, kind of like the way I was, some savings. The small time is not too big to harm, kind of. In a fund, vis-a-vis the investment track, where I would think that we'll consider the bigger, more organized funding resources, which have so where the source of a fund has been generated through very intentional investment activities in any sphere of market. So, there could be clearly very others. I mean, now we have the sovereign funds, and there's some of the biggest philanthropists today. I would say they are sitting on big inheritance funds, and which again, if you take a step back, I mean, Lauren Jobs, she's sitting on wealth created by Steve Jobs' enterprise, which was a hugely, profit-driven and return-driven enterprise. If I may just think of these two different kind of tracks, then I would take the next step and say that the purpose may very well be linked with the way these, the sources of funds, where the funds are coming from. And here, I'm being a little bit provocative, and this is a panel where we will be discussing some theorization issues. And I would posit that that maximization of returns is at the core, is as a paradigm in the investment space. And so, if for those who have generated their funds using that paradigm, it will be perhaps, not very unlikely that same mindset will also be operational when it comes to deploying these funds in more philanthropic purposes. And we hear now these notions about impact philanthropists, philanthrocapitalists, and it was pointed out earlier that the returns there could be a whole range of returns. It could be from financial return to what's your side, financial to social, like the whole scale, and yes, it is indeed, but it is that intensity and zeal of maximizing return, even if it's a social return. I mean, that's what I would say is something that would distinguish the philanthropic engagement that is sustained by investment funds vis-a-vis those that are by savings funds. To put this in perspective, social returns themselves, they perhaps could be unpacked, I would say. So at one end of the spectrum, social return would be synonymous with the public good, improving the opportunity structure of disadvantaged children, contributing to the creation of a globally competitive workforce, promoting environmental sustainability, and so forth. At the other end of the spectrum, social returns may simply be an instrumental step to further one's private returns in terms of social standings, political connectedness, or financial wealth. So in a way, I mean, we probably need to think of these returns as being fungible. And I think this is where perhaps it's a helpful way to think about a framework of why private capital comes into public space, is because it's a dynamic mix. And so it's not just one or the other, it's probably a little bit of both, again, we can link it back to the source. So I'll give a little example to walk you through this. Excuse me for a second. This is where PowerPoint is helpful, actually. So basically, if you think of somebody who is a technology, technology enthusiast, somebody who has put her own savings to start a technology startup, and just to create some perhaps improve reading skills of children in a school, and then what happens if this person then needs to rely on different sources of funds to grow her operation, and in that mix would somehow change perhaps the focus. So it could very well become perhaps a return-seeking investor might see this as a great opportunity to create a whole, new IPO and take it to public, et cetera, et cetera. On the other end, it could be a CSR initiative which might be giving, resources to this person. Again, without a doubt, that would also mean that some level of corporate shadow would be there. So it is the mix of the funds, of the source, that would in some way influence the purpose. And the purpose and mechanism, these two are intimately tied. I mean, Tony's and the colleagues' paper has so well talked about the mechanisms. And, a very interesting example could be to think about this notion of knowledge, creating this knowledge and evidence, that's a mechanism to kind of further your purpose. Consider the role of the technology firms, and this is where the phenomenon is very interesting, because the technology giants, they are essentially changing the very nature of schooling, if you may, right? Google is a case in point. Today, more than half the nation's primary and secondary in the US school students, more than 30 million children, use global education apps like Gmails and Docs, and etc. The company is saying that. And Chromebooks, the Google-powered laptops that initially struggled to find a purpose, are now a powerhouse in America's schools. Today, they account for more than half of the mobile devices shipped to the schools. And this is a very interesting, insightful commentary in New York Times, and the author notes, schools may be giving Google more than they're getting. Generations of future customers. So, I mean, I think when we think of a private philanthropic engagement, it is, it's a combination of different things, and it's perhaps to think about it dynamically in that frame is probably helpful. How much time do I have? 5. Okay. Now going back to this knowledge generation, what I found, and I didn't think about it until I started reading Tony's paper, what I found fascinating is that then to think about the way the technology firms, they create their presence. And by the way, all the technology firms are for-profit, just as a reminder. So they're actually creating the evidence. They're giving the standard approaches, give the devices to the teachers and the students. This is a very clever way of creating evidence. You're actually bringing your eventual customers. So when the teachers come and say, "Well, I'm using this becomes a very different proposition." 2 more quick things. In terms of mechanisms, on one end you have this drive as if to create knowledge. On the other hand, very paradoxically, there is the other strategy, the other phenomenon we often witness is called billionaire knows it right. So Bill Gates decided that big schools are not good, so he created small schools in New York City. After many years, he decided that was not a good idea. So the thing is, he has moved on, but the part of the challenge with this kind of enormous wealth, which is outside of a purview of any proper debate or accountability, is it is not just someone else's wealth; it's also what the school sector was engaged in. There's an opportunity cost in these kind of failed and risky, high-risk experiments. Schools could have done something else. I want to end by saying that perhaps looking at the global south, Brazil is a country I'm quite familiar with, and of course I'm originally from India. I see increasingly the long footprint of private engagement is creating a strong alumni network. And if you look at like the Lehman Foundation in Brazil, I mean they are essentially creating, or Teach for America, I mean the way they Teach for a World, it's essentially, I think, that it's not just those people creating a network of existing elites. It's just the formation of the new generation of policymakers who would be shaping this debate. So that's something also to watch out for in terms of mechanisms. Thank you again very much.
While Han is serves as discussant.
Thanks very much, Gita. Good afternoon to everybody. It's really a privilege for a simple foundation guy to be here in such a distinguished company and in this group of distinguished researchers. So I'll try to keep it brief. The role I try to assume comports two facets, the first one being to respond to the presentations of the panel, and the second to reflect a little bit initially and then as an invitation to the audience on how these presentations fit the larger symposium theme of philanthropy and education. So to the first presentation on motivations for philanthropic engagement and education, Clara, Anthony, Marina, thanks very much indeed for sharing this very insightful presentation. As a first response to it, I would say we have to underline the research perspective of the author's approach, a rigorous analysis in the format of a systematic literature approach at its basis. The authors are explicit about the theoretical and analytical character of the characterization of corporate-related organizations, as they call them. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we discuss this paper further, this theoretical framework. I do think that this methodological approach gives the authors the opportunity to relate the debate without judging it, which is often, as we all know, controversial and often ideological around policy influence by philanthropic actors. So I think that's the first great merit to have it related that way. I've got two challenges in the way I read the paper, and I was able to listen to your presentation. The first is to the methodological approach. I do think you, of course, outlined that this is a literature review, and it's the strength of it on the one side. On the other side, I do think there is a need to get into a qualitative, direct analysis of private actors' motivations and practice. And the second challenge I would like to present to this presentation is the definition itself of corporate-related actors applied to the philanthropic space, in my thinking, a little bit broadly. I don't think that this direct identification between corporations and the related philanthropies does always apply. One invitation could be to have a look at the legal frameworks of the countries you look at. In Germany, for example, the country I come from, the legal framework is quite clear about separating these two entities. So in my mind, that's a thing we might wish to reflect about. The other thing I wanted to underline as a final concluding remark from my end, you have presented 4 repertories of action, indeed, which you have distinguished, driven by the private sector. I think those are most convincing and present an excellent basis to dig deeper. And I'm pretty sure this will provoke discussion. What I have a little bit missed, even though you've underlined this, is a more diversified implication of non-Anglo-Saxon authors. You've had different languages, which is great. But I do think that the European space, and we've learned from the OECD numbers that there's 85,000 philanthropic organizations in Western Europe. I think that would be very interesting to look at it. And lastly, I do think, and this is something I would apply to the 3 presentations and maybe to the whole debate, I think we lack of a perspective from the global south. I think these things need to be reflected by those who should own the space, but unfortunately, as we know, do not own it. This is why we're so very keen on supporting, for example, local research. So lastly, the conclusions I think the authors of this study and the presentation have drawn allow us to link back the reflections to the overall theme quite nicely. So the trend of philanthropic actors is described to diversify and hybridize their roles and strategies is an indication of a conscious development within the sector. And this is pretty interesting to look at, I think, in order to understand better, and this is the overall goal of this symposium, and if I get it right, Natasha, of the subsequent symposia as well, to understand the the way the landscape of education, in particular in the Global South, is supported. Shall I pursue directly with the other two presentations? Okay. Brilliant, thank you. So thank you very much for listening to me on this one. The second presentation was by Prachi and Robin, mapping of philanthropic and philanthropic type engagement and investment in the Global South. With regards to this presentation, the main point, oh, here we can see you, hi. The main point I want to underline, that's the time difference, isn't it? I want to underline with regards to this analysis and presentation brilliantly done by Prachi and Robin when looking at empirical data on the activities of what they define as non-state private actors, is the implication of a more and more difficult distinction between non-profit and for-profit actors. The examples they quote, especially in the paper, which I had the privilege to read ahead, come mainly from Asia, and I do think they should provoke further discussion and also further research to establish a more adequate understanding of the hybridity of NSPs. The research gaps that both of you have identified are, in my mind, most clear, and the request for systematic gathering of data and NSP contributions should also be discussed within the perspective of countries in and research, that's my point from before, from the Global South. I do think this is something that really is necessary. The challenge in my mind, of the network analysis Prachi and Robin have established lies within the relationship between NSP implementers and programs in basic education and their funders. To me, it was pretty exciting to see the geographical and thematic concentration which you have found out, and this sheds a light on funders' choices, and this is very interesting. And my question to this would be, which is the empirical database funders choose in order to dispose of strategical relevant fields of investment? How do they do this? And why? Why do they pick those and not others? And the other question is all around the most promising drivers of change in that space. My challenge, and you've mentioned this indeed, I was very impressed by when it appeared here in colors, all these blue colors in the network representation. My challenge to this is with regards of the practicability and further use of network analysis of this kind with regards to further available data. And my question would be, because we haven't heard a lot about this, is about the scope of the broader international project that both of you have planned. And in terms of relating this presentation to the overall theme of this conference, I think it's the evidence of geographic and thematic focus in private investment strategies, which informs quite interestingly the broader discussion about the systemic contribution of private investment to education. So I was impressed by the plethora of actors you've identified. So to me, this is one of the key questions. It's about systemic change. So is the future of education funding going to be a jigsaw with all sorts of different actors, or is there any attempt to systematize these efforts? So to move on to the third presentation, Tamo, thank you very much indeed, on private philanthropy in education towards a framework of comparative analysis. What you've proposed, Tamo, in this presentation is, I believe, and I had the opportunity, of course, to read the paper as well, is an analytical framework of private philanthropic engagement in the education sector globally. And you have distinguished these three dimensions: source, purpose, and mechanism. So, and the whole debate is situated in your paper with regards to low-fee private schools and their funding in the Global South. You've established that distinction between savings, investments, and there's also another very interesting aspect, laterally, inheritance, in your paper, and that leads to a consideration of the quantity of funds and the different investments, the differences investments can make. In my view, I think this theoretical framework, and this is a little bit my point from the first presentation as well, would be probably would benefit to be discussed in more concrete settings. I read it as a rather abstract description, and you've repeated this, and this is, of course, the framework of an academic discussion, but I think concrete settings, looking at cases of spending, that would be, in my mind, rather interesting. The analysis of potential purposes brings out a set of explicit and implicit goals. And allow me to quote something you haven't spelled out here, but which I read in your paper, which is a conclusion you come to, which is a point of political capital you raise, which is important with regards to philanthropic actors in that space, with all sorts of, opportunities and chances they have of prime access. So this is a very interesting point. So I think this is something also that should inform our debate, especially when it comes to the newer forms of philanthropy as being described as venture, as it's been said. One challenge I would have for you, after I had finished the paper, it didn't really spell out what was announced in the beginning, which is the low-fee school context. Just 3 observations to conclude, if you allow. I really appreciate it as a foundation person having this role and reading these papers and speaking here, that these presentations have rather been observations than judgments. So this is a brilliant context to then enter into a real debate. The second thing is, I missed in all 3, this is the foundation guy who knows a little bit of his sector, I missed a little bit distinction within the very broad definition of philanthropic sector. So there is a distinction between, as I said, the corporates and philanthropies coming out of them. Bosch and Bosch Foundations are 2 distinct entities. Can talk about that later if that's interesting. The legal framework point I made, interesting. If you look at Switzerland, for example, or Austria, countries with rather big foundations as well, it's really different from so the citizen, through the legal framework, has a regard on the way the money is invested. And the third point that has not at all been mentioned, philanthropic institution is not naturally identical in its management with its founder. The example of Bill and Melinda Gates might be one, but if you look at other examples, there is no Rockefeller in the Rockefeller Foundation. So there is no Jacobs in the Jacobs Foundation directly. So I think it's really important not to put that in one basket. And the last and final remark, sorry Gita, I hopefully don't abuse of my time, is really about this whole exercise, and maybe if I can add this, Natasha, also to the whole series, is really cui bono. So who is the beneficiary of the knowledge that is gathered and produced here? I do think it's worth thinking about beneficiaries outside the classic academic field. Philanthropic institutions are one. Very happy to be part of this, part of the discussion, to learn and to be self-critical about evidence-based wisdom. But thirdly, I think there is many more actors that should learn about this. And again, my main point, it's these people and their countries, it's all about the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ola, for these great points, bringing attention to the context, legal context, the logic and strategies of the funders, but also your call to disaggregate and differentiate the philanthropic foundations. Those are all great points. Let me pass the floor to in the order of the presentation, so you can respond and then
first of all, thank you very much for your feedback and comments. That will come useful, sure. So regarding your first comment on methodology, sure, it would be really interesting to, at a more qualitative stage here approach. Maybe it will be difficult time-wise and resource-wise, but yeah, that would be key to understand. This was our last point regarding the motivations that are behind these changes or transformation in the sector. This is difficult to understand without interviewing people. So sure, that would be interesting, and also to understand the degree of intentionality and reflectivity of people in the sector about this transformation, which is something that at least for me it's unclear. Regarding the broadness of the definition, that was a very interesting comment, and sure, it's exactly like that. It's quite problematic. I would say that the initial motivation for that was that, at least in some contexts, the corporate and the philanthropic sector are quite organically networked. And maybe also it was partially a consequence of our lack of familiarity, or even the lack of clarity of the sector. Sometimes you don't know exactly who is pushing for what. I'm thinking in the case of Pearson, for instance, you have the Pearson, but then you have the Pearson Foundation, and sometimes you don't know exactly who is behind what. So I think that it was a consequence of that. But yeah, again, it would be very interesting to better understand how the foundations and the mother companies differ in the, I don't know, the profile of the staff working there, and how these affect the selection of one strategies or another, depending if we are speaking about the corporate part or the philanthropic part. So yeah, sure. Thank you for that comment also. And regarding the need to diversify countries, I think that, again, this relates to our methods here. The fact that we rely on peer-reviewed literature, basically, or even great literature we have access to, probably has really narrowed down the type of countries we are able to reach to. And so, yes, that is something we have to work on. But I don't know if you want to add anything.
Okay. Prachi and Robin, the point about the differentiation between for-profit, and he found that interesting, but if maybe you can address some of the other points that Robin raised.
Yes, we have 4 points that I saw come out of the discussion. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, yes, sorry. Yes.
So the first question was around typologies. Olaf, we spent almost 2.5 months wrestling with typologies. We can give you a big description of typologies, but when we actually tried to fit organizations into these typologies, it became very difficult to actually do that, partly because we're relying on publicly available data about the organization and how the organization explains itself and defines itself. And many times it is unclear, in fact. In our data collection now, we're collecting data in 6 countries right now: Japan, Thailand, Australia, Taiwan, India, Singapore. Did I miss any? Yeah, and in some of the organizations we've gone to, they themselves aren't entirely sure how they are. Like, they don't actually know what category they fall under. That has a very strong relationship with, as you've mentioned, regulatory frameworks. And in certain countries, as Arushi also had mentioned in the previous plenary, for example, in India with the CSR compulsion, now with the New Companies Act, that link between what is CSR, what is a foundation actually legally registered as a foundation? In India, actually, there's no real legal term of a foundation. You register either you're a trust or as a non-profit trust company, and then now under CSR they have different compulsions. So all of these things make it very difficult. We then decided to go on a more practical route for this initial mapping exercise, and we were very broad. We followed the Center for Education Innovation's own typology, and we had to keep it broad because there was no other way of moving forward. In the work that we're doing now on philanthropic and impact investors, we are using a broader terminology to incorporate different types of private foundations. That includes private foundations that are independently run, that are coming from corporates, that are also family foundations. And we are trying to get, in our qualitative analysis, different kinds of organizations that fall under that. So yes, we can have a big discussion about typology. The second question you raised was around priorities and how do funders fund what they fund. This is a big question that we are trying to actually answer through the qualitative work that we're doing. So let me backtrack. we've collected publicly available data on 800 organizations that broadly fall into private foundations or impact investors. From that, we're narrowing down to 300, around 300, as long as they have some education sector investment or programming. We are including them for the broader purposes of the network analysis. And so that is really looking at network analysis, broad-scaled mapping, the kinds of questions that you also raised about geographies. Where is the money going? The question around why is around motivation. And that question is something we're addressing in our qualitative interviews. And that, I mean, as you probably know, working in the sector, ranges. There are some investors that are very strongly personally committed to education. There are some who think that this is a good investment area. There are some who look at available data, but there are many who do not. And there are many who are actually swayed by the general discussion around the SDGs and the general need for financing, the general gaps in their own domestic contexts around what should be funded and how. And the final thing before I actually turn it over to discuss the data issues is, will it be a jigsaw effort or a systematic effort? I think there are different models that we're seeing, and I think those models are what are really exciting. There are some models in which philanthropic and impact investors are coming together and trying to form a collective to actually have a small managerial kind of capacity within themselves to direct investments in a way that is more cohesive and targeted. And then there are some that go it alone. There are some that are working with governments and really want to infuse extra financing, but also perhaps more reach in certain areas than others. And then there are some that are really taking, these would be a very small minority of percent of at least of philanthropies, are really just trying to do things in their own way, because they have massive reserves of capital. And so they're able to experiment and they're able to conduct different kinds of interventions without very much other collaboration. And we can discuss, I mean, whether that's positive or negative, but I mean, those are the models that we're seeing come out. I'm going to turn to Robin, because I think the data gap issue is one that we are struggling with, but I would like her to answer.
So in relation to your question on the utility of network analysis and how far this can take us, I think that, well, the literature suggested that network analysis was the right path to go, which is why we decided to explore it this way. And in the beginning, we weren't really sure if it was going to be useful to us at all, if we could even produce a network, which is really the impetus of this paper, to test out this methodology to see if it can help us explore this arena. I think that in terms of an area where there really isn't a lot of data, where we really don't know much about who is doing what and where, network analysis is really a useful method to kind of get a sense of the big lay of the land. Who's working with who? How are they working together? There's all kinds of different ways that you can put in attribute data in order to explore different characteristics of the network. And also there's all kinds of different measures of influence that we can do in order to identify which actors are key, which ones should we really narrow in on in order to explore more deeply, particularly in like the qualitative analysis that we're doing now. So I think it's really useful. And I think I also want to bring its utility back to your point about what do we do with the data that we're sharing here in this forum. One of the things that we're finding in our qualitative interviews is that, you know, these actors really, there's a big gap between the work we as academics are doing and what they're doing. They aren't really aware of the research that we're producing in academia. And so I think by doing network analysis, it kind of can give us a sense of which actors we really should be sharing our knowledge with, which we should be creating more strategic knowledge mobilization plans in order to work with them and share our work in a broader fashion and reach more actors than we reach through traditional academic dissemination methods.
I just want to add that the database and all the tools that we're going to produce from the study are going to be available publicly online for people to be able to use. Academics, funders, program implementers, that is one of our big goals with this. And so if people people want to liaise with us on that, and, you know, work with us further on that, please do get in touch. We really would like to make this as publicly accessible as possible.
Thanks so much. Let me, if you don't mind, just quickly, not as a discussion point, just as a thought, combining Olaf's great point that more research in the Global South should be done, and from the implementer side and from the beneficiary side. Would it be possible, and you don't have to answer it now because we're running out of time, to take the project level and then revert back and see where the funding is coming in the social network analysis? That you don't analyze the funders, but you look where the projects are. There's like co-citation, almost co-funding. The tie exists because they get funding through foundations that are sometimes categorized as for-profit and non-profit. That would really prove your point that there's a blurred line. The recipients get both from for-profit and from non-for-profit. And that would, I think, so if you go from the project level rather than from the funders level, so you have an attribution file where you have the funders, but what you really, the unit of analysis should be the project and not the funders, to make the point.
Yeah, so we are doing that. We're getting at the data two ways. We're getting at the data program level, and we're also getting at the data from the level of the funder. And the reason is because, again, we're working through publicly available data, and sometimes that data are available only through the program, and then we trace it, we map it back. And sometimes we're only able to get those data from the funder, and then we trace it forward. So we're actually trying to approach it from both ends, and certainly in the qualitative aspect, which is, you know, we're piloting this tool that we co-developed with Brookings, and we're piloting with about 15 to 20 organizations. We're trying to get the program level data from those organizations and map backwards. So we're trying to get it at all ways, but it is a really complicated and time-consuming work. And we're hoping that, you know, starting in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and South Asia, we're then able to replicate this. If someone wants to give us loads of money, we're happy to take it. We would love to actually take this forward to other regions and address especially the kinds of questions around the legislative framework in particular that we can't do in this study.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I would like to give the chance to Tom. I'm sorry that we, in this panel, won't have time for a plenary discussion, but let me give the floor to Tamo.
I'll be very quick. That's a great suggestion, Gita. And actually, as I was thinking about this notion of different sources of funds and how they commingle, you know, I think the parallel would be the NGO literature. And oftentimes, you know, what starts off as a beneficiary-driven grassroots initiative may very quickly become accountable to multiple, you know, stakeholders. And there's one other thing, LFP. Yes, I'm aware, and I would be very happy to expand that. And one final comment about that actually was from the first panel about this innovative financing and impact bonds we hear a lot about. I actually used to do a lot of innovative financing. I used to work in Wall Street. And the firm I used to work for doesn't exist anymore, Lehman Brothers. I'm very worried about these innovative impact bonds. I'm very worried because when everything is boiled down to an indicator, it can be gamed. We know that from education itself on that.
Okay, thanks. Let me just use one question to finish up, so the plenary has something to say. The question of Olaf, the need to have a typology of philanthropies. Does OECD or GPE, I would think since you're collecting data, you have a typology. Would you mind just telling us, in case others cannot join your presentation, the kind of typology you use?
So, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So my name is Evelina and I work for the OECD. And so I work for the network of foundations, but we work together with the statisticians from the OECD to collect this data on philanthropy. And I'll present it tomorrow. But on the typology, just to tell you that we use the traditional definitions for the time being, but we are now still kind of working on this for the report that is to come in 2018. But the thing is that we've only, even for the selection of the, of the foundations that we've invited to the survey, we use the definition of philanthropy, which is the institutional philanthropy. So, for example, nothing from the individual private giving was not taken into account. So to some extent, this is why we are interested in it. And also, I really agree with Olaf that sometimes you need to be a little bit flexible on definitions, especially in this sector. So we did 4 studies on the country level as well, in India, Mexico, Myanmar, and Kenya. And in those 4 countries, the definitions for foundations are so different. You have so many foundations that are only foundations by name, and they are really NGOs, they have no endowment. So when you try to keep to some kind of typology, it's indeed very difficult. In the Arab world, typically, we try to concentrate on private foundations. However, in the Arab world, most of them are actually partly publicly funded as well. So I think we try to be practical for this OECD, and we won't come up with a completely new typology. I think we'll try to kind of use the existing ones and try to see what makes sense also for what are we trying to kind of collect.
Okay. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time in this panel, but we will have, after the coffee break, continue with parallel sessions and hopefully have much more time for the audience to participate.
It was already so rich, and we could have taken even much more time, but we still have some time. So I invite you now just for a coffee break or tea. I think that's good timing. And I also invite you to maybe address questions that you may have to the speakers during that break, so that we don't lose track of the very rich discussions that we had in this first part of the afternoon. After the break, we'll get back, and then we'll have 2 parallel sessions as listed here. The choice is free, but we do hope that the sharing will be sort of equitable. It will be in this room as well as the room just next door, and we will reconvene at 4 o'clock, that is. So thank you very much. The coffee is just up the stairs. And thanks again to all the speakers for the very rich discussions.